It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, or if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Henry Ford. How bad are things for the future generations? You're noticing how everything is getting more and more expensive. Wages aren't going up. Houses are unaffordable. It feels like things are getting worse. You hear about the end of the dollar, but what's really going on? So let me explain. Central bankers promote policies under the disguise of stabilizing prices so people can afford to buy goods. They promote policies of achieving full employment, more and better jobs. They promote policies to lower inflation, but they've ushered in an unprecedented artificial intervention that's causing the financial problems you're experiencing. But let me be clear, you cannot fight what's about to happen. You're fighting the inevitable. It's like standing on a train track and trying to stop the train with your bare hands. There are only two things you can do. Either stick your head in the sand and slowly go broke, or follow the smart money by getting on the train to build wealth. If you understand how the finance game is played, then you stand a chance of building wealth and leaving the US before its inevitable collapse. For some reason, Americans are the only people dumb enough to think a collapse won't happen to them when it's happening as we speak. They think the collapse is sudden, like falling off a cliff, but a collapse is slow, more like walking down an incline. Here's what's going on. Everything you hear from the government, the Fed, central banks, a lot of what you hear is double speak. And you need to dissect what they're secretly telling you to your face so you know what moves to make. Here's what the former Fed chairman Ben Bernanke said about the 2008 crisis. It is not the responsibility of the Federal Reserve, nor would it be appropriate to protect lenders and investors from the consequences of their decisions. Do you understand what he's really saying? The Fed was supposed to not allow banks to get to a point where they're too big to fail. They're supposed to be the arbiters of bank mergers, but what they're really doing is they're picking winners and losers. The Fed was created in 1913 and originally tasked with maintaining stability, low inflation, and full employment through monetary policy. Fast forward to now, and the Fed carved out a new role on its own as a superpower. They operate in a way to grow and defend their power, not to help you in any way. Legislation to deter too big to fail has been around since 1933. The Glass-steagall Act was put in place because the 1929 Depression, it restricted banks from using federally insured customer deposits as collateral for large-scale speculation and asset creation. It prevented them from gambling with your money. Banks that were engaged in both of these types of practices were required to pick a side, either service deposits and loans or gamble with securities and merge companies. By being forced to choose if they want to service deposits and loans or gamble, they became smaller, so bank bailouts became unnecessary. But the Glass-Steagall Act was repealed in 1999 under President Clinton, and as a result, banks went on a buying spree. The large banks consumed up the smaller ones. The goal was not profit. The goal was to use money to gain more assets. Who cares about profits? Their size gave them the confidence to engage in riskier practices. They became so big that they could create toxic assets and provide financing to their customers to buy them. That's how the subprime mortgage problem became a decade-long crisis. Big banks could buy up mortgages, turn them into complex securities, and either sell them to a global customer or lend them to investment banks and hedge funds that engaged in these trading securities. The Fed allowed all of this to happen. They made big bets with borrowed money, your money, and exacerbated the risk to which they exposed the world. Imagine you go to a casino and you don't have to gamble with your money. You gamble with other people's money. But all the profits that you make when you win are yours, and the losses that happen as a result of your recklessness is their loss to bear. So how reckless do you think you're going to be when you gamble? Citizens are collateral damage and hostages to the financial system. Your bank deposits are nothing but cannon fodder for reckless speculation because they know that they're too big to fail. They put themselves in a position to gobble up assets by getting rid of legislation to stop them. Do you understand why all of this happens? It's because the general public doesn't pay attention. People would rather make fun of billionaires being killed in a submarine to the Titanic instead of paying attention to what's happening to their money. People complain about housing being too expensive, low wages, and so on, but they ignore what's happening to the financial system. Countries like China and Russia are paying attention. China doesn't want to copy the US. They look at the US as a case study of what not to do. Banking and finance is boring to most people. It's made to be complicated. It's a three-card monte, so they can hustle you right in front of your face while you smile and have a good time as they take your money. No significant regulations have been introduced to fix the structural problems behind the last financial crisis. Banks and the markets have been subsidized by quantitative easing, the printing money policy where they just create money out of thin air, and central banks have colluded to provide global artificial money and subsidies as they see fit, rather than to focus on long-term growth. Since the crisis, G7 central banks have pumped money into private banks through quantitative easing. It's when a central bank, they just conjure up electronic money and then they inject it into banks and the financial markets in return for purchasing bonds and securities or stocks. So the result is a lift in the money supply within the financial system and reduced interest rates to make the cost of borrowing money really cheap. So all of this favors the big banks and corporations and boosts the value of those securities. If you ever wondered why the stock market went to astronomical levels during COVID when the entire economy was shut down, this is why. It's conjured money. It's just a conjured money scheme where the cost of money is rendered abnormally cheap. Bank lending doesn't grow, nor do wages or prosperity. Instead, central bankers create asset bubbles through the artificial stimulation of banks and markets. And when these bubbles pop, economies are destroyed. There's no law or requirement to divert the Fed's cheap money towards helping real people. This is because borrowing and investing in the real economy requires funds from private banks, not central banks directly. And private banks are under no obligation to do anything with this cheap money that they don't want to do. That's how the monetary system was set up. Imagine if your parents got paid for you to live in their house, but they're under no obligation to provide you with food, clothing, nothing. They can take the free money that they're given and do anything with it. Not only that, but you still have to pay them rent. Central banks realized that adjusting benchmark interest rates was no longer effective without quantitative easing. So they flooded the banking system with cash, and banks aren't required to increase their spending to the mainstream economy. They're not required to help the economy in any way. So instead, the banks, they hoard cash. US banks colluded with the Fed to get that cash by stashing their bonds as excess reserves. And because of the emergency economic stabilization of 2008, they receive 0.25% interest per year from the Fed on those reserves. So not only do your parents get free money for you while not being required to help you out in any way, and not only do you still have to pay rent, but the more money your parents hoard, the more money that they keep, the more interest they make on that money. Wall Street used its easy access to cheap money to increase speculation in derivatives and other complicated securities. They used it to buy back their own shares, basically manipulating their own stock. And all of this has approval from the Fed. Naturally, these banks dialed back their lending to small and mid-sized businesses because, why risk helping the economy when you get paid more not to, and you risk less in the process? Danger of having a system that relies on printing money is that when central banks stop printing it, the system can go into shock. They continue to do it with no exit plan, and there's going to be an epic fall. It's only a matter of when. The Fed works with other central banks to decrease the cost of money. The fabricated money doesn't come from taxes, revenues, profits, or economic growth. But once again, Don't use this information like most people by sticking your head in the sand and saying, well, there's nothing I can do about it. There's nothing you can do about it. But you can gain wealth by jumping on the train instead of trying to stop it. You just have to study how the finance system works. Don't wait for someone to tell you what to do or how to think. Study the financial system and look for ways to profit from it. You're not going to fight the system. You're not going to stop a recession. You have to follow the money. 8 years after the 2008 crisis began, the big 6 U.S. banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, they collectively held 43% more deposits, 84% more assets, and triple the amount of cash that they held before. The Fed allowed the biggest banks to essentially double the risk that destroyed the system in 2008. Then you have the recent bank failure of Silicon Valley Bank, and JP Morgan, which is considered the riskiest bank in the US, is allowed to buy them as well. You're not going to fight or stop the inevitable. The Fed injects fabricated money into the financial system. This cheap money resulted in trillions of dollars of debt, pushing the global level of debt to more than 3 times global GDP. The G3 central banks act like they're helping the general economy when all they're doing is speeding up its demise. It's a rigged game, and the only way to win is to jump on the train. You can't opt out of using money. You're playing this game whether you like it or not. Central banks determine the value of money by setting interest rate levels directly. They make additional adjustments by purchasing bonds. So the more bonds they purchase, the lower they can keep interest rates because they manufacture a demand. This pushes up bond prices, which by nature pushes down interest rates. They try to influence the worth of currencies by buying and selling them locally and internationally. This is a finance capitalism economy where you can make money from money. You need to learn this if you stand a chance of building wealth, because regardless of what job you have now, you're going to get replaced. Developing countries challenge the status quo of the US and European money policies by developing new economic trade and alliances to get away from the Fed and away from the US dollar. Non-Western nations like China and Russia had no interest in becoming casualties of another US-born crisis and came to understand that dependency on the US dollar put them at risk. The US became a superpower because the world wars spawned a US-led monetary structure that came to dominate the markets. In 1944, financial leaders, they met with each other at Bretton Woods to craft a monetary system centered around US and European interests. While Europe rebuilt its war-torn cities, the US took advantage and developing countries were overshadowed. But now the system is coming to an end. The 21st century gave rise to a financial world war. Printing money was the weapon of choice, so fabricated funds towards subsidizing the private banking system and buying government debt, corporate debt, and stocks. Central bankers superseded the government. They set the cost of money and provided the confidence in ongoing liquidity. The world was their battlefield. Your deposits are cannon fodder, and your livelihood is about to be collateral damage.